Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a very accomplished professional from Zurich, Switzerland, Mr. Peter Stevens. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ashutosh, and welcome, and I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. Peter is an executive coach and consultant. In his own words, an accelerator, a problem solver, and a listener. He's the founder of the Personal Agility Institute. He's the author of a book titled Personal Agility, Unlocking Purpose, Alignment, and Transformation. He's also written 10 Agile contracts, getting beyond fixed price and fixed scope, and Extreme Manufacturing Explained. So, Peter, let's start by asking you a question. Can you share your insights into the development and impact of your book, Personal Agility, Unlocking Purpose, Alignment, and Transformation?
Of my book. The most amazing thing about personal agility has been the impact it has had on people's lives.
Right.
Find themselves in a difficult situation. That could be their businesses aren't going well. That could be they're in a burnout. They're in some sort of personal crisis. And they use a couple of simple questions and a couple of visualization tools. And, they use that to figure out where they are, where they want to be going, and to start move on course. Okay. And so, at a very personal level, there are at least a dozen cases that we've documented in the book. And I've lost count of the number of people who said to me, I started doing personal agility 4 years ago. In fact, the last time I heard it was maybe a week ago. And I still do it today because of the impact it's been having on my life.
How fascinating. But before we move any further, how do you define the word agility?
Agility, that is a really good question. For me, I came into the world of agility through Scrum. Which is kind of a simple team-based framework for working together to solve, complex problems. And this whole agility thing, I didn't really get it. And then, but somewhere the Agile Manifesto started to resonate with me. Okay, and it starts out with, we're uncovering better ways, and now I'm going to paraphrase a little bit to make it more general. We're uncovering better ways of doing what we do by doing it and helping each other to do it. Now that kind of leaves open the question of what do we do? And that's always very context specific. So one of them is we're uncovering better ways of organizing our lives, being who we want to be.
Right.
The other sentence in the manifesto, which is really, really key, starts out with our highest priority is, and then they talk about doing something software. But, for me, the clarity there is clarity of purpose. Why are we doing what we're doing? Okay, and so for me, agility is first and foremost about clarity of purpose. It's about learning. So, the world is complex. We really don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, and that's more true today than it ever was.
Right.
So, learning, collaboration, and purpose. Okay, and so for me, agility, can be summed up very nicely in these three words. And if we really want to get, if I had to bring it down to one word, it's about hope.
Okay. That's
because this hope.
That's a great definition. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, why do we keep digging? Imagine you're an archaeologist digging in the dirt. You don't know if you're going to find anything, but you keep digging. Okay. And so fundamentally, it's about hope. So that for me is what agility is all about.
Fascinating. Thank you. And Peter, based on all your experience, what are some of the most significant misconceptions about the term agile or agility that you have encountered, and how do you address these?
So I think the Agile movement as a whole, and Scrum in particular, have very much been victims of their own success. You start with a great idea. I think it was Alistair Coburn who said, if you come up with a good idea, it's going to be ignored or misunderstood or misused. And all of the above has happened. It was a hugely good idea. It started out with a group of software developers who were looking to find ways that actually worked, to produce better software, as opposed to the methods that were being forced onto them by people who didn't understand their jobs as well as they did. And at that, it was very, very successful. Okay, it's possible to be, quite predictable about developing software, both in terms of the budget and what you're going to achieve with it.
Mm.
But the problem is most people who used it, they were the people who the Agile movement was rebelling against. And
Right.
somewhere, it's kind of like Star Wars, the Empire Strikes Back or Revenge of the Sith.
Wonderful. Okay.
Things that were causing us to be problematic before there was, Agile and Scrum. Well, these things are still very present in most companies, and they keep reappearing, and they don't go away that easily.
Mm.
And so I think there's a lot of people who think they understand what Scrum and Agile are about, but they don't, and they do more harm than good. I think there is a lot of, how should I say, commercial interests out there. Particularly coming from, any large consulting firm wants to have its people engaged over. We get drowned in the tools and the processes, and are we doing it exactly correctly? And are we following the Bible, the various religious documents that people use to describe Scrum and Agile with. And so we have lots of discussions that aren't really about what agility was there for. And agility is there for better results. Agility is there for innovation.
Right.
And better collaboration. Okay. Better, they say individuals and interactions above processes and tools, but most Agile methods are mostly processes, and some of them are tools. And as soon as we get to the toolsmiths of the world, it's all about tools. And now tools are great because you can sell tools, and selling that scales, but that's not really addressing the fundamental problem.
Right. Great response. My next question, Peter, is how does the personal agility system that you have developed facilitate better decision making for leaders and teams?
Okay. So where I think personal agility is really different than everything that came before it. Okay, because we've had Scrum, we've had Kanban, we've had visual representations, but personal agility did not start out as a process to follow. It's at its heart, it's really a series of questions. It's about sense making.
Okay.
The first and most important question is what really matters. Okay, so let's take the metaphor of you are flying or sailing. In fact, let's go back to sailboats before they were GPS. You don't have a motor, and you can't just turn it on and ask Google where you are. You have to keep track of where you are. Okay, and so when we're trying to get across the ocean, how do you navigate? You've got reference stars. Okay, so we've got the North Star, the Southern Cross, depending on where you are in the hemisphere. We've got the three sisters of Orion's belt, which basically tell you where west is. Now, you're not necessarily navigating to the North Star. I mean, we don't go to the poles very often. I won't say it never happens, but it's not most of our destination. But the pole stars, or those stars, they give you reference, telling you where you are.
Right.
Okay. And if you're clever, you can figure out where you are. If you keep track of that over a longer period of time, you can keep track of where you're going. And that also tells you if you're pointed in the right direction. Okay. And so, even an airplane today, flying over the Atlantic with GPS technology and everything, every half hour or so, they check their position, they report into air traffic control, they say where they're going to be an hour from now or half an hour from now. Okay. And so that's kind of, making sure that we're going where we're supposed to be going. And if you're getting off course, what do? You get back on course. Okay. And, so I think that, when we talk about leaders, leading an organization, the key question is what really matters.
Right.
And if we have agreement on that, that's where we get alignment.
Okay.
And that what really matters question, that takes you into a lot of interesting places.
Right.
What are our immediate priorities? What are our long-term goals? Oh, wait a minute, we don't have any long-term goals, and we don't have any overarching priorities. Well, this is the first conversation that we need to start. Okay. So once you've got this, what really matters, then it takes you through a series of steps to kind of figure out where you are. And like the jet plane or the sailboat, crossing the ocean, you look at where you're coming from. How have you been spending your time? What have you been spending your time on? Okay. And you look at what you could do. And so, the other thing is we all have got too much to do. Okay. I don't think that organization. well, I think it applies to pretty much everybody, but the leaders are feeling the pain particularly because they spend a lot of time in meetings and a lot of time in Zoom calls, and very often they get to do a lot of overtime just to get any their so-called real work done or productive work done.
Well said.
Yeah, so you kind of look at where you're coming from, and that's also pointing to where you're going to. And once again, you've got that question: is that taking me where I want to go? And so for us, that means, how are we spending our time? Are we spending enough time on the things that are important?
Okay.
Or are we constantly getting interrupted by things that are urgent?
Right.
And, so you start to ask yourself these questions, and you start to realize that, well, actually, we don't have an overarching strategy. And this is why it's difficult for our people to cooperate. Okay, especially across departments.
Yeah.
Well, right. So now we can start some interesting conversations, build alignment about what really matters. And once you've got that alignment, then it's much easier to agree on how we want to move forward. What do we want to do next?
Well said. My next question is, what advice would you give to executives hesitant to adopt agile methodologies in their operations?
I would say start with yourself, try it out with yourself. That's the interesting thing about personal agility. Okay. So here is the problem that you have as an executive. Okay. Now, psychological safety. Okay. Is it okay to say things? Will it be held against you? Now, the larger the company, the less safety you have, the higher up you get. Okay. Right. Everybody's kind of sitting on the ejection seat. Okay. So if you're going to say, hey, I think this agile stuff is great and we should do it, that's actually a very high risk statement unless you've got a lot of support from within the organization. And it's an even higher risk statement if you don't have the personal experience that you can authentically say this agile stuff is a good thing. Okay. So, when I work with leaders who say we'd like to be more agile, the first thing we do is we start with, okay, well, let's start getting good at, kind of these basic skills of sense making. Let's get good at doing them for ourselves. We see how prioritization works. We understand that we have too much to do. One of the interesting side effects is we often get a lot more empathy and understanding for ourselves. A lot of people are very hard on themselves, especially, when they're kind of driven to the heights that make them an executive leader. Right. And just having that understanding for kind of what you're doing, what your intentions were, what's actually able to come out, and what's possible. You start to get more perspective and more understanding for yourself. And once you can use these tools effectively for yourself, then it becomes easier to start experimenting with them in a context of, well, maybe we start doing it first with a trusted partner. Well said. Okay. And then and then, so, rather than trying to go from 0 to 100 on our first try, we say, okay, let's learn to walk before we can run. Then we learn to run. Now let's start training for the marathon. And as you build your skills and build your confidence, all of it, at some point, there's this aha moment. I think the first thing is, oh yeah, this stuff really works. It's helpful to me. I have more clarity. I have more confidence in what I'm doing. Right. Then the next aha moment comes as we start building these bilateral communication. And I like to do this with an executive team. Okay. So we're talking, C-1, maybe C-2. And they start working individually. And then the next step is for them to come together. Okay. And I did this with a group this spring. I was working with them we started right around, I don't know, February, worked with them for about 4 months. And at about the 3-month mark, they had a significant crisis in the company. And they were able to talk about it. They were able to talk about different things and admit, and discuss what they were worried about. It was okay. They created a trust culture. Okay. So I think, the first step is to kind of be able to kind of be agile yourself by learning how to do it and feeling confident that you can do it, so you have authentic experience to build on. Right. The second is to start to come together as a team. Building your collaboration and communication skills, so that the way you work with each other leads to dialogue. Okay. It's a trust culture. Okay. And then the last step is to start saying, how do we apply this to our organization? Okay. Now, so the thing to remember is executives face real risks and their companies face real consequences when they get it wrong. So that makes them conservative, and rightly so. they're careful to make big changes because of the complexities involved.
Right.
But once they have confidence and once they see, hey, we're getting better because of this, and particularly if you can kind of build this consensus around the direction forward. And this is one of my favorite things. Change is easy if you want to do it for you personally, and for an organization, change is easy if everyone wants to do it. So that kind of shapes the direction of how our how our improvement deployment should work. It's as much about building consensus and building agreement that this is the right way to go, as opposed to imposing any particular methodology or framework.
Great response. My next question for you, Peter, is what are some of the key factors in creating and sustaining a culture of agility in an organization?
The key factors for creating and sustaining a culture of agility. Yeah. I think the first factor is somebody needs to want to do it. Okay. Once you've said, I want to do it, then you stop debating about whether you're going to do it and you start figuring out how to do it. Okay. Right. And you say, start thinking about what's kind of the first step that we could take. The other thing is when I look at a lot of discussions, I see that there's kind of the how we do it. Okay. And when we talk about saying, let's do an agile transformation, that's all about the how. But the why, I think, is the most important.
Right.
Okay. This concept of, what is our vision for the company 5 years from now, 25 years from now? What's the world that we're trying to create? And, right now, I look at the companies out there and I say, which companies have had the most impact on the world's economy in, say, the last 15 or 20 years?
Right.
And the companies, if we go back 30 years, we can talk about Apple and Google and Microsoft. If we look at more recent companies, they're pretty much exclusively Musk companies, Tesla and SpaceX, the top two. They've seriously disrupted every industry they've touched. What's interesting about them is their vision start with a 1,000-year vision for humanity, which they then translate into a 20-year master plan. And then they start executing on the master plan. Okay, so they have this clarity of purpose about who they are and why they're there.
Yeah,
and I haven't seen that in many companies. I was just pointed to a talk by Alan Kay, who was a researcher at Xerox PARC.
Right.
And Xerox PARC, geez, that was 20 years ago. People may have forgotten it by now. But Xerox PARC basically invented half of the internet and half of modern computing. They invented Ethernet, that has the actual cabling. They invented the Windows icon mouse, the modern user interface. And I didn't know this part of it until, and they also invented the laser printer. Okay. Now Xerox PARC, they got a lot of criticism because somehow they lost control of the user interface thing to Apple and Microsoft. But they made tons and tons of money just off of laser printers. Okay, and the spin-off companies, and I assume they've got patents as well that kind of help them along. Between Ethernet and the various other things they invented, in 5 years, they took 25 researchers from all different disciplines, and they said, what's going to be possible in 25 years? Right. And on the basis of that, they started asking the question, how do we get there? Okay. And then they started kind of, iterating towards, they had this clarity of vision and purpose. They were trying to make this 25-year vision come true. And it gave us an incredible surge in innovation. Right. Okay. So I think, kind of, we take it back to that what really matters question. And we say, let's get clarity of purpose. And that clarity of purpose comes from a long-term vision, and then talented people working on the problem. Okay. And I think what the difference between the most part, Tesla and SpaceX seem to be able to capitalize on their innovations, whereas Xerox PARC doesn't. Okay. And so, if I were a leader in an organization, I would be asking deep questions about who is the right person to be leading the organization. And I don't think the finance guys are the right guys to do it.
Right.
Finance is important, but we see this with Boeing today. Okay, Boeing was an amazing airplane company until they got taken over by financial management, and it's been downhill ever since. And right now, it seems like I just saw another video on LinkedIn about a Boeing that landed with the nose gear collapsed. They're just kind of having one problem after another right now, and that's I my personal belief and the studies that I've seen suggest it's about the people who are running the company fundamentally.
I agree.
And the money is important. Money is like air.
Sure.
If you can't breathe, you got a problem, but your lungs aren't your brains.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Thank you. So I'm going to now move, Peter, I've got time for two more questions.
Sure.
I want to talk to you about your other avatar as a coach.
Yes.
So the first question for you as a coach is, what are some of the core qualities of an effective agile coach? And how can one develop these qualities?
Okay. Well, I think the core skill, believe it or not, is listening. And the second core skill is asking questions. And what I'm going to say here is maybe a bit controversial, but I think having some knowledge of the subject matter that you're in is also helpful.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now this is if you go to the coaching federations, they will say, no, the coach is not a subject matter expert.
Right.
And this is perhaps the border between coaching and mentoring. Okay. But I think, mentoring is kind of like coaching, except the person has been there before and has useful experience that you can learn from. Okay. So the answer to the first two questions, how can you develop these skills, is really simple. Practice.
Right.
Okay. And this is actually what I do in my leadership development program as we start to, for me, I call these dialogue skills. It's not about turning leaders into coaches, but it's about giving leaders the tool set of the coaches so that they can use those tools when they're appropriate. Okay. They say if all of your if all of your problems, if your only tool is a hammer, all of your problems look like nails. Well, if you've got a hammer and a screwdriver and a wrench and maybe one or two others, you can handle a wider range of problems.
Right.
So, when I teach people coaching, the first thing that I do is I teach them to listen without interrupting, which is really hard to do if you're not used to it. Okay. And we see a lot of discussions in meetings. People can barely finish each other's sentences.
Yeah.
And the reason they're not allowed to finish each other's sentences is they don't feel heard. They're not actually listening. And so it feels contradictory, or counterintuitive. But what people need to do is kind of sit back, listen, just like air traffic control. After you've heard what the other person has said, read it back to them to give them the confirmation that you've heard them. Once they felt heard, then they'll be willing to listen to you. And then again, the same is true of questioning, asking questions. When most people start their, start trying to ask coaching questions, the only questions they come up with are kind of binary yes/no questions, so-called closed-ended questions. And closed-ended questions don't start a conversation. They're there to finish or conclude a conversation. So what's the alternative? Well, these are the open questions, the ones that invite to a conversation, and even more so, the powerful questions. So what we do is we practice asking questions, and I give people a lot of example questions to kind of spur their thinking and give them some stuff to try out. And then we just practice it, and we practice it in a safe space. And when we got some confidence on it, we practice it in a somewhat more, less safe, but still safe space. And only on the third or fourth, only after we've done it like 3 or 4 times in increasingly challenging environments, only then do we say, okay, well, give this a try in the real world. Okay. So, step number 1, developing your listening skills, really practice listening without interrupting. Step number 2, develop your dialogue skills. Learn about questions and practice asking questions, and remember to listen to the answers. And the third one, the mentoring, the experience, I think that's the hardest one. Some things you only learn by getting your own skin knees. So I would encourage people to, do real projects and do real things. Don't just jump in as a coach, especially if you're young. Coaching skills are good skills to have. In fact, I think, when I look at, when I look at the, 20 somethings that I'm working with, I think the coaching part, those coaching questions are very hard for them to do. There might be a brain development thing there going on. I don't know, but it's a skill that it almost feels like they're not ready for it yet. Just like they weren't ready to learn, algebra when they were 10. Okay. When they're 15, they can do it. It's not a problem, but, and I'm kind of wondering if the coaching skills isn't a further development of the brain, but this idea could be totally wrong. This is just my personal pet
No, but I
theory.
agree with what you're saying. I agree with what you're saying. Peter, we now run out of time. So I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me about the Personal Agility Institute. Thank you for speaking to me about agility at such length. I learned several new things from you today. Thank you also for speaking to me about coaching. And a key takeaway from our conversation for my viewers and listeners is the importance of listening. Thank you, Peter, for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Okay, thank you so much, and to you.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.